Hello fellas. Welcome back to Top 5 Choices. Today's video I am gonna do a detailed review and pick the top 5 best camera for photography, 2021. After doing proper researches, we came to the conclusion that meets the best in terms of overall. Kindly leave a like if you find this helpful, and I'd appreciate if you subscribe to my channel and turn on post notifications if you haven't. We will be also providing affiliates link to purchase from Amazon. Kindly use to for best offers and purchase from anywhere in the world. We'll be back with more videos. The Nikon D3500 is a 24-megapixel entry-level DSLR with an APS-C CMOS sensor that is cheaper, lighter, and has a longer battery life than the D3400 that it replaced. It was designed with the new photographer in mind and features a guide mode that will essentially teach you how to shoot in various situations. The D3500's guide mode puts it into an easy-to-use space in the market. This mode makes it easy to tell the camera what kind of scene you are trying to capture and essentially teaches you the basics of photography, such as shutter speed, aperture and exposure compensation along the way. This is a camera that a brand new photographer can pick up and start making decent pictures without a steep learning curve. Face detection AF only works in live view mode, where the rear screen is used to frame up your photo, instead of the viewfinder, and although it reacts quickly in sunny conditions, indoors it got laggy, seemed to have trouble keeping up. There is no touchscreen functionality on the 921K LCD screen, which can be a little frustrating if you're used to shooting mirrorless or with a phone. Another unfamiliar, but minor, annoyance could be that the optical viewfinder only covers 95% of the frame. It's pretty standard for an entry-level DSLR like this, but means it's hard to precisely judge what is and isn't in the edges of your photo. The camera's image quality is beautiful on the low end of the ISO range and just fine up to about ISO 6400. The Fujifilm X-S10's design is simultaneously vintage Fujifilm and a big change from its other mirrorless cameras. At first glance, it looks like a slightly smaller Fujifilm X-T4 with a larger, deeper grip. Because of that grip, the size difference isn't, in practical terms, much different from the X-T4. You won't be slipping the XS10 into your pocket, but it is noticeably lighter than its sibling at 465 grams, making it about 3/4 the weight of the X-T4. A magnesium alloy build also gives it a more premium feel than cheaper models like the Fujifilm X-T200. It's only really when you come to use the XS10 that you notice the big changes from the rest of the X series. Fujifilm cameras are renowned for their dial-heavy approach to controls, with most offering a triplet of wheels for tweaking your shutter speed, ISO and exposure compensation. The XS10 is a great little all-rounder on paper, but how does it perform in the real world? Overall, it's very competitive with rivals at this price and size. The real star is its IBIS system, but the XS10's autofocus, burst shooting and battery life are all more mid-range than high-end, hence the price tag. For general shooting, the XS10's autofocus is very reliable and on a par with the X-T4. While the performance naturally varies depending on which lens you're using, its face and eye detection AF was very reliable, even when used with lenses like the XF50mm f/1.0 WR. Slightly less impressive was the tracking autofocus. Like the X-T4, and now the X-T3, thanks to its recent firmware upgrade, you now get a little box and wide/tracking AF mode that lets you pick a subject in the frame to lock onto as you recompose. In our tests, this worked fine when the subject was close and contrasted well against the background, but more slightly distant subjects, for example, ducks on the water, proved too difficult to track. Fujifilm's autofocus systems have certainly come a long way, but in demanding situations they still lag behind class-leading systems like Sony's real-time tracking AF. You also don't get bonuses like Animal Eye AF, which can be found on higher-end cameras. Still, for general shooting, the XS10's autofocus is more than good enough for most situations. One of the biggest performance differences between the XS10 and X-T4 is burst shooting. The XS10's fairly average max of 8 FPS, with the mechanical shutter, and limited buffer means it isn't the most powerful tool when it comes to shooting sports and action scenes. At 8 FPS, the buffer hits its limit after only 23 RAW files, about 3 seconds of shooting, or 105 JPEGs. While it's possible to shoot at 20 FPS using the electronic shutter, you then only get 17 RAW files or 32 JPEGs. The Nikon D850 is Nikon's latest high-resolution full-frame DSLR, boasting a 46MP backside illuminated CMOS sensor. But, in a fairly radical departure for the series, it is also one of the company's fastest shooting DSLRs. This combination of properties should significantly widen the camera's appeal to high-end enthusiasts as well as a broad range of professional photographers. The use of a backside illuminated, BSI, sensor means that the light collecting elements of the sensor are closer to the surface of the chip. This should not only increase the efficiency of the sensor, improving low light performance, but should also be expected to make the pixels near the edges of the sensor better able to accept light approaching with high angles of incidence, improving peripheral image quality. The D850 has gained a more usable electronic front curtain shutter option, EFCS, which can now be used quiet shutter modes, as well as live view and mirror up mode. To get the full benefit, though, you need to turn on exposure delay, which has had 2 sub-second delay settings added. However, exposure delay persists across all shooting modes. Thankfully, and presumably thanks to a redesigned shutter and mirror mechanism, mirror/shutter shock doesn't seem to be much of an issue, even without engaging EFCS. The D850 has no anti-aliasing filter, which should allow for slightly finer detail capture but with added risk of moire, if any of your lenses are sharp enough to out-resolve a 45.7 MP full-frame sensor. There's still no sign of the clever design Nikon patented, so, unlike the Pentax K1 or Sony RX1 or 2, you can't engage an anti-aliasing effect if you do find false color appearing in densely patterned areas. The D850's 45 megapixels allow it to compete directly with the higher pixel counts of the Canon EOS 5 DSR, Fujifilm GFX 50S and Pentax 645Z. In the very finest detail you can see a difference, with the Nikon not able to correctly render the fine waves in the banknote. The Fujifilm X-T4 is the company's latest high-end photo and video APS-C mirrorless camera. It brings in-body stabilization, faster shooting, improved autofocus and a larger battery to the already very capable X-T3. Fujifilm says that the X-T4 is a sister model to the X-T3, rather than a replacement, which is borne out by the specs and pricing. It's a 26 MP camera capable of 20 FPS shooting and 4K capture at up to 60p. In use we found it offers distinct benefits over both the X-T3 and the older X-H1. The X-T4's image quality is essentially the same as that of the X-T3, with the exception of the new color chrome effect blue processing option, 2 extra film simulation modes and a clarity processing parameter that applies large radius sharpening to give images more punch. The X-T4 features the same multi-shot HDR mode first introduced on the X Pro 3. This shoots, aligns and combines 3 images and tries to cancel out any movement that's occurred between them. To give itself leeway for alignment, the images are slightly cropped in and then upscaled back to 26 MP, which results in a slight reduction in fine detail. The HDR mode has 5 settings, specified in the menus under Shooting Settings, Drive Setting, HDR mode. These are 200%, 400%, 800% and 800% plus, along with an auto setting that chooses from these options, based on how bright and contrasty the scene is. Canon's EOS 5 South African Rand is an excellent camera for professionals or anyone that's looking for a supremely capable option for almost any type of photography, from sports and action to studio portraits and landscapes. It's a 45 MP full-frame mirrorless camera that can shoot clips of 8K video, has impressive dual-pixel autofocus and excellent ergonomics. It can also capture 10-bit HDR stills and video for HDR display and is the spiritual, and mirrorless, successor to Canon's 5D series DSLR cameras. It's not a perfect camera, but we think it's an excellent and highly competitive addition to an already crowded field of competent high-resolution full-frame mirrorless cameras. At 45 MP, the EOS 5 South African Rand is the highest resolution Canon camera we've seen for quite some time, and that puts it up squarely against some really capable competition. There are just bags of detail everywhere you look. The EOS R5 has an AA filter. It still shows plenty of moire here but perhaps a hair less than the competitors in other spots. As ISO values climb, the EOS R5 really looks to hold its own up to ISO 12800. By ISO 25600, it starts to lose ground to the Nikon, but is just slightly better than the Panasonic. We'd probably not bother going much higher than that. Moving over to JPEG, the EOS R5's default sharpening parameters look good, and its files have a ton of fine detail while looking reasonably crisp. It looks to be using finer radius sharpening than any of the other offerings here, and holds on to even the tiniest details impressively well. Color response is hard to fault, but that's largely true of the competitors here as well. At higher ISO values, the Canon tamps down on grain more ISO than the other options, though some details start to go a bit mushy. But there's really not a whole lot to separate this particular crowd, with the Nikon, Sony and Panasonic looking to have a bit more perceived detail that's likely just due to the extra grain. The Canon is also doing a good job of preventing color spread while preserving saturation at higher ISO values. Canon's latest iteration of dual pixel autofocus comes with some new options, but will be largely familiar to users who've seen the system evolve over the years on the company's mirrorless and DSLR models. Essentially, your choices are for various sizes of AF area or a combined face plus tracking mode.